Hey everybody! So it's time to do another Enforcer Hall of Fame video, and on the live during the live stream I did on Monday night, I said that this would be my next person put into the Enforcer Hall of Fame, and it's defenseman Dave Manson, and he is now getting put into the Enforcer Hall of Fame, and now, obviously, probably something that jumps right off the screen to you is that he only had 79 career fights, and most of these players that I've put into this Hall of Fame have all been over 100. A lot of them up over 150, even over 200 fights in their careers, and Dave Manson only had 79. Dave Manson is one of the better hockey players that I've put in this Enforcer Hall of Fame. Dave Manson was not just there to fight; he could play hockey too, and that's one of the big differences between the full-on enforcers. Look at the last one I did, Tony Twist. He was a full-on enforcer. He was only there to fight, and he only had 20-something points his entire career. Dave Manson was one of the toughest defensemen in the NHL, and he was a really physical, badass player, but he was not only there to fight, he could play hockey too, and he was a very, very good player, and that's why he played over 1,100 games in the NHL. He played a long time because he was a good player. He was not just there to drop the gloves. So, Manson only had 79 career fights, but it's not about how often he dropped the gloves. It was about how good he was with the gloves off and who he fought when he did fight. And he fought some of the toughest players in the NHL. The person he fought the most often was Basil McRae. Basil McRae is in this Hall of Fame for being a great enforcer. He fought Bob Probert twice. He fought Joey Kocher 3 times. Manson fought against really tough players. Jeff Odgers. The list goes on and on with Manson. So even though he has less fights than a lot of the other players on this list, he still absolutely belongs here because he fought against really tough competition, and he was a very good fighter. He just didn't fight as much because he was valuable in other areas of the game just than fighting, and he was a really good player too. So when you look at Dave Manson's career, he played over 1,100 games in the NHL, 1,103. He scored 102 goals and 288 assists for 390 points. On top of that, he had over 2,700 penalty minutes, 2,792 in his career. Ton of penalty minutes. Like I said, he only had 79 career fights. And that gets interesting because his penalty minute total is sky high. Yet his fight total isn't, which means a lot of those penalty minutes didn't come from fighting. 80 fights times 5-minute majors would be 400 penalty minutes. So minus one fight, that's 395 of those penalty minutes came from fighting majors. That's still over 2,000 that were from other things. So there must have been a whole lot of misconducts in there and a lot of other penalty minutes as well. It's not like fights were his main source of penalty minutes because they just weren't. They were less than, more than 2,000 of those minutes came from other things. The most fights he ever had in a season were 18, which came in 1988-89. 16 of those were in the regular season. 2 of them were in the playoffs. He also had 54 points that year with the Chicago Blackhawks, the most he ever had in a season in his career. And he 2 times, both early on in his career, including the 88-89 season, went over the 300 penalty minute mark. But he only did that twice. However, he went over the 100 penalty minute mark 13 seasons in the NHL. So most of his career, he was over 100 penalty minutes. Obviously, that's how you rack up minutes to get to over 2,700 in a career. Manson began his career with the Chicago Blackhawks and played in Chicago from 1986 to 1991. Then he went to Edmonton for a short time from 91 to 94. Then he went to Winnipeg/Phoenix when they made the move from 1994 to 97. Then he played in Montreal for a short time in the late 90s, 97 to 99. And then at the end of his career, he made some quick stops in a few different places. He went to back to Chicago for a short time. He went to Toronto, and he went to Dallas at the end of his career. But those were pretty much all short stints, and mainly he when I think of him, and I think he's best known as being a Chicago Blackhawk, and Manson fought more, the most at the beginning of his career, and as his career went on, he fought less and less. And I think, that's one of the main reasons that when I think of Dave Manson, I think of the Chicago Blackhawks, because most of the fight highlights, most of the video that I've seen of Dave Manson were when he was fighting, a lot, which was those early years in the late 80s and early 90s with Chicago. So, Manson played for, obviously a number of different teams in his career, but the first one that comes to mind when I think of him is Chicago. I think he had his best offensive season in Chicago. He had his most active fight season in Chicago. Both his 300 penalty minute seasons came with Chicago. So I think he made probably his biggest impact as far as enforcing goes with the Chicago Blackhawks. And that's certainly who I remember him being a member of. Obviously, this was before I was born. I didn't see him play there, but just in watching highlights and old video and fight video and stuff, Dave Manson is a Blackhawk in my mind, even though he did play for a number of other teams. So one thing with Manson that really sticks out is how much the fighting decreased as his career went on. When he, those early days in Chicago, he was a full-on enforcer. He was fighting double-digit times a year. He was fighting very tough opponents. But as his career went on, he fought less and less. He had some middle of his career seasons where he would only fight once or twice a season, and he really, never fought as much again as he did in those first few years in the NHL, and I think a lot of that has to do with him being a good player, an important player. A lot of times, kids come into the NHL and they fight a lot, and they, that's how they make it, and they're really, really tough. Like Dave Manson is really, really tough. So he shows it, he has to prove it, and he fights all the tough guys and fights a lot, but then he becomes a better player. He doesn't have as much to prove because he's already fought those guys. He's proven he can handle himself. And the fight numbers decrease, and I think, we've seen that a lot. We see that a lot with, guys who are willing to drop the gloves and fight regularly, who are also good players. We see them fight a lot early in their careers, establish themselves, and then it kind of tapers off as the career goes on. I think Milan Lucic is a prime example of that. When Milan Lucic came into the league in Boston, and he had a lot to prove. He was supposed to be this next big tough power forward. He had to fight a lot of guys. His rookie year, he fought a lot. He fought pretty much the way an enforcer would his rookie year. And even his first few years in Boston, he was a guy who could regularly drop the gloves and fight 8, 9, 10 plus times a year. But as you saw as his career went on, by the end of his time in Boston, he was only fighting maybe 5 or 6 times a year. Then he went to LA. He fought a few times with LA. He's gone to Edmonton now, and now he only fights really 2, 3, maybe 4 times a season compared to when he was fighting 10 to 12 early on in his career. People that are also established themselves as good players tend to fight less as their careers go on. It's not always the case, but it often is. And Manson is definitely someone that did that. Wayne Simmons is another example. He had a lot of fights when he came into the league in LA. When he first went to Philadelphia, he had a lot of fights. Then he established himself as a 30-goal scorer and a high offensive producer. Good power play guy, and the fight numbers came down to the point now where Wayne Simmons only fights 3 or 4 times a season. So We saw that with Manson, where he was fighting double-digit times at the beginning of his career. Then it knocked down to maybe 6 or 7 fights. Then there were some years in there where he only fought once or twice. And that's just a natural occurring thing with somebody who's not a pure enforcer, who's not just there to fight. Brings value in other areas as well. The fights tend to taper off as the career goes on. So 79 career fights for Dave Manson, which is not a lot, especially for people on this list. However, that does not mean he was not a great enforcer. That does not mean he was not one of the most brutally tough guys in the NHL, because he was. He was absolutely one of the best defensive, physical, nasty, mean defenseman in the league throughout his career, and put a very, very good career together, both as a player and as a fighter. And now his son, Josh Manson, plays for the Anaheim Ducks, and while he's certainly not exactly as physical and as nasty as his father was, because the game has changed so much, by today's standards, Josh Manson is a very physical defenseman. He throws a lot of hits. He's willing to drop the gloves, and had he played in the 80s and 90s, I think he'd be a very similar player to his father. However, the game has just changed so much where he's not going to be at that exact level. However, Josh Manson, the apple does not fall far from the tree. He's a similar type player, just in a very different league, and he's one of my favorite young defensemen in the league. He's a really tough defensive guy, and very physical as well. So Dave Manson, now in the Enforcer Hall of Fame. Very good career, very good fighter, very good player, and certainly one of the toughest defensemen of his era. So with that, like, comment, share, subscribe, follow on social media, check out offthewallhockey.com. All those links are down in the description below. If you'd like to further support the channel, the links to our Patreon and merchandise store are down in the description below as well. Keep spreading the word about this channel. Let's keep this thing growing. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll talk to you guys soon.